All right, in this video, we're going to be looking at Community Ecology 8.5 of Unit 8 of Ecology AP Biology. What is a community? Look at that picture. It's pretty cool. I think it was like a 24-hour time lapse of a watering hole in Africa. And so you can see all the populations that are interacting there. You have some elephants and some zebras and some other things over here, and maybe it looks like I don't know, maybe an ostrich. Maybe an ostrich over there. There's probably some things swimming around in this water too. There's some plants. All of these things are a community. A community is a group of all the different species that interact in the same location. You could call it all the populations in an ecosystem if you'd like to call it that. And so with communities, you have this idea of community diversity. And this is typically measured in two uh, ideas, both species diversity and species composition. Species diversity is the variety of species and the quantity of those individuals in a given community. And so you can see here on the left, you have several different species, and they all tend to be of equal quantities. You have the same number of species over here, but there's a lot more of this grass than there is anything else. Species composition refers to the identification of each species in a community, and this diversity is actually something that can be modeled mathematically. Imagine that. There's a number called Simpson's diversity index, and Simpson's diversity index measures the amount of diversity in a habitat. The higher the index, the more diverse that community is. Typically, the more diverse a community is, the more adaptive it is. We'll talk more about that in the next video. And just so you can see here, uh, small n is the total number of organisms of a particular species. Big N is the total number of organisms of all species. So that would be the total population. And then you're going to take each species and do that and add them all together. That's what this little sigma means. Subtract that number from 1, and that's going to give your diversity index for that population. And so you could, this is 0.63. We can do the same thing for this population and get a number, and we would be able to say, well, community A is more diverse than community B, or whatever the numbers might show. And that's the purpose of the Simpson's diversity index. And so it's important to talk about the different interactions in a community, and we're going to represent these interactions with some symbols. And so that's what you see out to the right of this word is typically there's two symbols representing the two individual or the two species in this interaction, and these interactions will determine how populations access energy, how they access matter, and how they are benefited or how they are impacted negatively based on these interactions. And so competition is the first one. Competition is typically a negative reaction or interaction, or a minus interaction. Why is that? Because well, you see here, these lions and these hyenas are not playing together, they're fighting over resources. All right, and which one wins? Well, the lions are probably going to win, but ultimately they all lose because they're having to expend more energy than they normally would in order to get resources. And so this is a minus interaction. This is an interspecific interaction, in that lions, one species, is competing with a different species, hyena. Inter means between, so between two different species, whereas competition can also be intra specific, meaning that intra means within, and so this is within a species. And so here you have two lions fighting one another in order to assert dominance over a particular group. Reproductive rights for the pride, eating rights, and that sort of thing are going to be at stake in this sort of interaction. But both of these lions will lose some resources, and that's why you get the minus interaction there. Mutualism is the opposite of that. Mutualism is a plus plus interaction, in which both species benefit from this interaction. Here's a picture of ants on an acacia tree. Acacia trees actually produce these little bits of sugar for the ants to harvest. And so the tree is producing something, and the ants will actually farm these little bits, which is just incredible. And then what do the ants do in return? Well, they defend the tree. If a giraffe comes by and begins eating the acacia leaves, the ants will come out and attack the giraffe, which, you'd expect giraffes to have some defenses against this as well. They probably just eat, eat some ants. But this is a mutual relationship. Both species are benefiting and giving, both of them are giving in order to get something. Commensalism is a plus zero relationship. And so what does that mean? That means one species is gaining benefit and the other species isn't getting anything. And so there are a kind of fish, and the name of this fish actually just escapes me, but these fish will actually swim alongside a shark, which seems to be a dangerous endeavor, but I guess they've gotten really good at it. And what they do is they swim right alongside of the shark, and when the shark eats, they're messy eaters, and so these fish will kind of clean up, and they gain some protection from being near a shark, which is also good. The shark gets nothing from this. There's no benefit or detriment to the shark, and hence the zero number there. But these little fish are benefiting from being able to swim with the sharks. Predation is an example of an interaction in a community. Predation is when one species uses another species for food. So this is a plus minus relationship. The plus is obviously the one that's getting to eat. The minus is the one that's being eaten. And this isn't, I mean, as you can see from this picture, this isn't always an easy endeavor. Sometimes the predator can oftentimes can be dangerous for the predator as well. But prey species have defenses as well. But this typically plays out to be a plus minus relationship. And then the last interaction that we'll look at is parasitism, which is also a plus minus interaction. This picture is incredibly blurry, oddly enough, but this shows a parasitoid wasp has laid its eggs in a caterpillar, and those eggs have hatched, and the little wasp larvae are now exiting the worm, causing the worm to die, sadly. And so this is an example of a plus minus relationship, but it's not necessarily, it doesn't always result in the death of the organism, or at least the immediate death of the organism. But this relationship is definitely only one organism is getting benefit from this. There are lots of neutral interactions that happen in a community too. Here you see a zebra and an elephant just standing next to each other. They're not competing for resources. They're not negatively affecting one another. They're not positively affecting one another. They're just living in the same place. So we would call this a neutral interaction. And there are lots of neutral interactions in environments. In fact, um, there are some interactions in which a third individual gets no benefit or loss from that. You'll see that particularly with large species like elephants. They can exist in a relationship with other things, and they're largely unaffected or don't affect other things at all. And so what do we mean by that? Well, here's an example of a predator-prey relationship. Um, and this is typically called a boom-bust cycle, because if you look, as snowshoe hare population goes up, what would you expect to happen in return? Well, the lynx population is going to go up. As lynx population goes up, what's going to happen to snowshoe hare population? It's going to go down, and this cycle is going to continue. And so what's happening here is the lynx and the hare are actually balancing one another out. And it's a function of natural selection too, because which lynxes are going to survive, or which snowshoe hares are going to survive the fastest. They're going to reproduce, and it's going to be that cycle over and over again. And then if you were to put moose population in this, it would just be a straight line, because the lynx aren't eating the moose, and they're not really competing with the rabbits either. And so they're just going to be a straight line in comparison to this population. So that's kind of what I would mean by entering that third one in there. Um, Another thing that you need to talk about with communities has to do with trophic cascades. A trophic cascade is when the removal of one species causes a kind of a cascading effect on the rest of the ecosystem. The wolves in Yellowstone or a great example of this. We'll be talking about this in the next video as well, I believe, and talking about how when wolves were taken out of the Yellowstone ecosystem, well, then their prey species increased, the deer or the elk, and when the prey species increased, the amount of vegetation is going to decrease, and when the amount of vegetation decreases, it changes the scope of the land because trees control riverbanks and all that kind of stuff. And so, interestingly enough, what they've seen since wolves have been reintroduced into the Yellowstone population, that the rivers have even changed their course, which is just fascinating and a great example of a trophic cascade. How one species can legitimately affect everything in the whole ecosystem. And lastly, is this idea of niche partitioning, and a niche is a species' role in its environment. And this idea of niche partitioning is essentially you have multiple available niches here. This is showing us like a seashore, and what this means is that species will alter their use. You can see it here. I'll just read this. Can alter their use in order to avoid competition. So rather than competing with the flamingos, the ducks will go to shallower water in order to get resources. You'll sometimes see this called the competitive exclusion principle as well, where they basically can't occupy the same niche, and if something comes in to occupy the same niche as ducks, then only one of them will win that competition, and that makes sense. That's natural selection. Either they will adapt or they will die. And so communities typically have these falling out of roles, and then if a new species comes in, those roles can be altered. We'll be looking at that actually in the next video.